Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our material for philosophy. This is chapter 7 on feminist and care ethics. This is the moral theory that has been very much developed as of late in the last 100 or so years in particular. This is a relational agent-based emotion guiding normative moral theory, so it has a lot of overlap with virtue theory. But it is certainly its own distinct approach to ethics and one that differs greatly from other normative theories that we'll discuss in our class. So there is a chapter for this, so please be sure to have a look at that before proceeding. So again, as always, let's review the terrain for the most commonly cited normative ethical theories. So we've talked about action-based theories. Consequentialism and deontology are two primary examples, but of course we have egoism, divine command theory, Kantian deontology, and two different kinds of utilitarianism, act and rule. Then on the other side, we talk about agent-based theories, which instead of focusing on specific actions that we should or should not perform, focus instead on developing the right kind of character. And in virtue theory, we have Aristotelian virtue ethics, and then we have Confucian virtue ethics, which overlap with Aristotle, but have some important key differences. Also agent-based is feminist care ethics, which, as I mentioned a moment ago, has been very much developed and added to the last 100 or so years. Of course, there have been female philosophers before then, but it's safe to say that the views, just setting the stage here, the views that are on display here have one very common theme, and it's that they are very much male dominated. So if we look at consequentialism, egoism, and utilitarianism in particular, what names crop up here? John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham are two of the primary proponents of utilitarianism. Egoism, yes, we get Ayn Rand, a very famous egoist proponent of egoism, but most of the egoists are male and are motivated by people like Friedrich Nietzsche. Divine command theorists are predominantly male. Obviously, Kant himself was male. Aristotle, Confucius. There's, of course, nothing inherently wrong with talking about a male-based theory, but we notice some trends. And one of the trends is specifically the deliberate omission of female perspectives. And worse is the kind of claims that people like Aristotle and Confucius and Kant and others, with perhaps the exception of Mill, who is very pro-suffrage, pro-women's rights philosopher at a time when that wasn't very common for male philosophers to profess. Nonetheless, male philosophers have taken a very dim view historically about female rationality as well as female intellectual inferiority. I mean, if you look at Aristotle in particular, not just him, but other Greek philosophers, not so much with Plato, but you notice some very disparaging remarks made about women. And so we need to call out these theories for such blind spots. It doesn't mean that there aren't things that are admirable in all of these theories. We're not here to say that we should stop talking about them, but it is safe to say that many of the philosophers had some very questionable views about women as well as people of color. So we need to be honest about the history of philosophy. So feminist care ethics is born out of a recognition that philosophy in particular has been dominated by Western male voices. And it's also an approach to ethics that seeks to turn the tables, so to speak, and start incorporating more emotion and family-based ethics into our normative ethical theories as kind of a general introduction. So as I said, normative ethics, action and agent-based theories are obsessed with reason. And they also make this very common split between the public and private. And specifically, if we're looking at Aristotle, as well as other Greeks, the public figures are going to be male. The people in charge, the people who are in the Senate were men, and the private domain is reserved for women. And that was a commonly held view throughout Western philosophy. And specifically, the attribution of reason to the public, that is the male, and emotion to the private life or the female, right? So these kind of built-in, baked-in associations of male attributes with being about reason, about being more intelligent, right? Aristotle is very explicit, and so is Confucius, about how women lack the same rational characteristics that men do. So it shouldn't surprise us that we get these very long-running and perpetuated stereotypes about the male philosopher or the male sense of reason compared with the female. And so from this, we get a kind of atomistic conception of the self, the male being, right, the rational one, women more in tune with emotion. And these distinctions get, again, perpetuated into our ethical theories. And one of the things that 20th century female philosophers really start hammering home is that this gives us a wrong and one-sided view of moral life. Okay, these universal concepts are too broad, and often, even with virtue theories, they reflect hegemonic masculinity or masculine attributes like strength and power and reason over and above, right? Domination over and above others. This is a key feature for why thinkers like Aristotle and others tried to justify slavery. And so this is not a situated or even an accurate reflection of gender or sex differences. It does not take into account social, political, or economic realities of moral agents. So instead of trying to reform the utilitarian calculus or the deontological framework, many feminists and authors in the 20th century in particular claim that what's required is a radical transformation of our ethical framework. So what is hegemonic masculinity? Well, I've kind of already painted this with broad strokes here, but typically what we mean by this is on the male side, or assuming masculine traits like the mind, for men, it's dominated by reason. It's determinate, it's public, it creates government as citizen. And who are going to be those in charge? Men, okay? And they're active. Men are assumed to be independent. They can transcend their animal natures and create and shape human history. And this gets associated with being the norm, right? With being humans, right? Why we say mankind. It's a defining form. Going back to, we associate strength and, again, domination, the man as a protector, as a warrior. Whereas on the female or feminine side, the story goes, right? They don't use the mind. They're more in tune with the body. And what's associated with the body? Negative associations like emotion, being indecisive or indeterminate. Private, right, satisfies natural biological needs associated with the family. Instead of being thought of as active, philosophers have thought of women as being passive, right, being dependent, subject to decision of man, waiting for men to make decisions for them. And this gets associated with bad, right, as being the other, that they do inferior work, or that they're weak and that they should be relegated to the household. So while a lot of these are very broad claims, it's pretty easy to see how the history of philosophy, and not just philosophy, but the history of gender and discussions about identities have become entrenched and calcified over time. And what feminist philosophers in particular are going to say is this affects the philosophy we produce. It affects the way that we think of and talk about conceptions of masculinity and femininity and otherness, right? And it affects how philosophers and thinkers of color are treated. And it certainly doesn't produce the best philosophy that we could hope to produce. Because if we look again at the history of philosophy and the history of even political thought, we notice a pretty much domination of the discourse by male philosophers who write as if these assumptions should be taken for granted. And I think that's the point that we really want to emphasize here, that we can't separate so cleanly the male philosophers from these certain attributes. That's one of the key insights from 20th century feminist philosophy. It's hard to separate those things cleanly because people like Kant, people like Aristotle have these assumptions baked into their philosophy. Okay, so we often think of reason being separate from emotion, and that's one of the starting points for 20th century feminist philosophy. There's this split and hierarchy. Reason was understood not only as separate from emotion or sentiment, but as antithetical or superior to it. Thus, being deemed rational required a rejection of emotion, and those deemed emotional were irrational and immoral. And a key piece of evidence for this claim is Kant himself, right? Writing in the 18th century, almost 2,000 years after Aristotle. Kant explicitly says that when people act immorally, they're acting irrationally, and they're acting emotionally, right? Associating with the female or feminine characteristic. And for action-based theories, right, for deontology like Kantianism, this informs this search for abstract and universal moral principles. And for utilitarianism, it's meant to be rationally and impartially calculating what will maximize happiness. So again, it imagines that we can think of humans stripped of any socioeconomic status, being able to calculate how people should or shouldn't respond to things like universal moral principles or calculating happiness. And that's just not the moral landscape that we find ourselves in. So this is going to lead to some very motivating criticisms by feminist philosophers in the 20th century and continue to this day. So another big thing that informs this criticism of traditional moral theories is this public versus private split. So again, in the public realm, going back to Aristotle and Confucius, the public realm is distinctively human and distinctively male, okay, where man is thought of as being able to transcend their animal nature, to be reasonable, deliberate, calculating, and the private realm is distinct from that. This is the natural or animal realm where women reproduce the species, care for the young, cook the food, right, tend to the household. But right, this assumes and this perpetuates the notion that that these two things really are distinct, which many people say aren't potentially as distinct as these male philosophers might assume. It also seems to relegate the private realm to an inferior notion or an inferior status. Because when we think of parenting and caregiving, while male philosophers might think of this as being naturally inferior work, over time, we've started to question that, right? That parenting and caregiving equally transcends animal nature, especially insofar as it involves helping children to develop as moral beings. Additionally, the relationship of care is implicit in parenting. So traditional theories like utilitarianism, deontology, and Aristotelian virtue ethics neglect it, and that's insufficient because these things, instead of being inferior, are primary and crucial to developing virtuous, nurturing, and caring individuals. The third problem, right? The self is equal to masculine, which is greater than supposedly feminine characteristics. Again, the self in Western thought is thought of as atomistic, self-interested, independent, individualistic. And we get this in Descartes, we get this in Aristotle, we get this in Kant. So, lots of names would get thrown in here. This hegemonically masculine conception gives rise to the previously mentioned problems and leads to inaccurate theories. This is not representative specifically of women's experiences or the experience of marginalized masculinities, including and especially people of color. And again, this largely relies or stresses interdependence and relationships, communal, familial, and social relationships. Whereas in the Western conception of moral theories, we're meant to think of, again, people being individualistic, thinking in a vacuum, right? We're thinking of the stereotypical philosopher in the room, like Descartes, pondering, what really exists from the comfort of a cozy chair in front of a fireplace, right? That's just an inaccurate conception of how to think of moral rules and how to think of reality. So a lot of 20th century critics are going to say, this is just not, it's not even accurate. And we wouldn't even want it to be accurate. It doesn't stress the everyday relationships, the love and care that we get from caring for another with our parents, with our siblings, with our community and social environments. So what are some solutions to all this? Well, a very well-known 20th century feminist philosopher, Virginia Held, starts formulating some responses. And this is where we get feminist ethics really coming into much more of a mainstream political discourse that had been for so long neglected. So she says, rather than interpreting moral problems in terms of what could be handled by applying abstract rules of justice to particular cases, many tend to be more concerned with preserving actual human relationships and with expressing care for those for whom they feel responsible. So give emotions a more prominent role in our moral lives, especially the emotions of care that accompany close relationships. Also, we need to reimagine this public-private distinction. The flourishing of children ought to be at the very center of moral and social and political and economic and legal thought, rather than, as at present, the periphery. So change this distinction. The private activity of parenting and caretaking is not inferior. It's of particular public moral importance. Also reimagining the self as this atomistic notion, abstract entity. To be adequate, moral theories must pay attention to the neglected realm of particular others in the actual relationships and actual contexts of women's experience, which had been obviously neglected in the history of moral philosophy. So instead, we should think of the self as situated in a particular context. A communal social conception of the self includes women and more accurately accounts for the self as enmeshed in particular relationships, especially those relationships of care. So what are some appeals of feminist ethics? Well, for one thing, it's much more inclusive than views that have been formulated in the past. It addresses fundamental instances of male bias in traditional ethics and allows close attention and inclusion of the experiences of women and traditionally marginalized groups. It's anti-egotistical, so it's not just like other theories which might be consistent with some notion of egoism like utilitarianism. It's explicitly anti-egotistical. It's instead a communal conception of the self, which makes it so that self-interest and altruism are no longer easy to distinguish. And it's relational. It takes specific and special obligations into account, especially relationships in the family, though not unconditionally. It's still conditional or contextual. And it emphasizes care. 20th century feminist ethics really emphasize not abstract rules of reason, but rather care. It acknowledges the role emotions play in motivating the implementation of reason and deepening understanding of what is right. So how do we know which emotions are virtuous? Just like we asked, how do we know which virtues are those that a virtuous person would do? Well, I mean, we got to start with some biases. The first step to recovery is admitting that we have a problem, right? And certainly there have been biases in the past, and we need to recognize them for what they are. Um, Certainly some emotions can conflict with reason. We can admit that, but everyone has biases. We just need to praise biases which favor inclusivity over exclusivity. Um, Also, we need to value emotions, which are central to building and sustaining close relationships. Instead of discarding emotions like the traditional moral theories do, we need to emphasize and celebrate things like empathy, compassion, love, sympathy, fidelity, and sometimes even anger, which, again, emotions are not a central feature of the traditional moral theories. Again, certainly a lot of overlap with virtue ethics. There are similarities, combination of reason and emotion, as well as the need to cultivate care and concern, but there are differences. Virtues are reconceived according to feminist ethics. They're non-hegemonic, non-masculine, so as to avoid previous issues that we just discussed. Also, similar to virtue ethics, it has an emphasis on flourishing. So we saw this with Aristotle, eudaimonia, which means human flourishing. Feminist ethics typically say that care leads to this as well. Reflecting on and cultivating these emotions will improve the likelihood of progress, human flourishing, and universal obligation. There are certainly, of course, differences between feminists. We should not say, like with the other ethical theories, that everyone is in the same or everyone is in agreement on everything. There are certainly different philosophers who say different things. Virginia Held is certainly a monumental figure in modern care ethics. For her, care itself is a practice or virtue rather than a theory. It's not something that we learn through abstract reasoning anyway. It's something that we do. And because it depends upon contextual considerations, care is notoriously difficult to define, but it does involve maintaining the world of and meeting the needs of ourselves and others. It's a practice, value, disposition, or virtue, and is frequently portrayed as an overlapping set of concepts in her work. It could also involve a form of labor, but also an ideal that guides normative judgment and action. It clusters around a set of practices and values, and instead of being thought of as inferior to some sort of public life, the roles should be reversed. What happens in the household or the family is of central importance, not distinct or relegated below the supposed public life, but instead forms the focus. How we interact with our household informs how we interact with our community. So this is a nice overlap with Confucian ethics, right? So Confucius does agree with that aspect of it, that how we treat our household reflects largely on how we treat our community and society as a whole. There's other feminists who argue that emphasizing personal interaction and dependency is an emotional state, activity, or both, and that is functional. Other feminists emphasize styles of situated moral reasoning that involve listening and responding to others on their own terms. Other feminists might focus on talking or framing about these issues along a more general level, a species of activity that includes everything we do to maintain, contain, and repair our world so that we can live in it as well as possible. And that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment. So, of course, different conceptions of care are going to come up in the literature, but we notice that there are some common threads to this conception of care and the emphasis on care that we don't see in the other moral theories. So again, for thinkers like Tronto and Fisher, that we might frame this as 4 sub-elements of care that can be understood simultaneously as stages, like virtuous dispositions or goals. It could be something like attentiveness, a proclivity to become aware of need, right? The needs of those on our local street corner, or the needs of, right, just like we would care for the needs of our own sons and daughters, nieces and nephews, brothers and sisters. It involves responsibility, a willingness to respond to and take care of others, right? competence, the skill of providing good and successful care. It's not just whatever I think is good care. There's actually got to be some objective notion of providing the right kind of care. And it's also going to rely on responsiveness, consideration of the position of others as they see it, and recognition of the potential for abuse in care, which is certainly something that comes up in discussions of caring for elderly adults here in the US, right? And elsewhere around the world. But it's certainly, responsiveness seems to be a big part of that. So let me leave it there. There's a lot of feminist ethics that we won't get to talk about here, but I've tried to paint the broad strokes of the response of feminist ethics and why it reacted so strongly to the other ethical theories that we consider, specifically the action-based theories, utilitarianism, and deontology, and how feminist ethics can be thought of as sharing some similarities with virtue ethics, but being its own distinct normative ethical framework. So thanks for listening as always. Hope this helps, and I'll see you next time.